Well, good morning. Can everyone hear me all right? In the back, can you hear me fine there? All right, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. So thankful to see you all here so early in the morning. I bring you greetings on behalf of John MacArthur, everyone at Grace Community Church, everyone at Grace to you from sunny Southern California, where when we flew out here is probably in the mid-80s and sunny, and here it's not in the mid-80s, and though it's sunny, but not in the mid-80s. I just want to say real quickly on behalf of my partner, my brother in Christ here, Virgil Walker, how privileged we consider ourselves to be here. Although we're not in a church facility today, I just want to commend the folks at Christ Bible Church, Pastor Levi, and everyone for their courage. And I mean that in all seriousness, because you do not have that kind of courage in evangelicalism on a broad scope to be able to address an issue like this head on. And I just want to let you know that you are in for some heavy content today. Okay, so if you've got a pen or paper or some sort of device to take notes, you may want to do that. I would highly recommend that. But Virgil and I come fully loaded today. So I hope you're prepared. As Pastor Levi mentioned, the title of my first talk today is the Interconnectedness of Critical Race Theory and Marxism. And the reason I chose this title is because one of the first lies, and I have to be blunt, it is a lie. One of the first lies you're going to hear from critical race theorists is that it has nothing to do with Marxism. So I'm here to debunk that. And I'm going to debunk that by using critical race theorists in their own words. So that's going to be the first half of my message. I just want to walk you through a historical chronology of how and why critical race theory is connected with Marxism. And then the second half of my message, I'm just going to lay out for you why critical race theory as a worldview is unbiblical. Okay? So strap in, here we go. Okay? All right, you guys ready? Yeah. All right, so I want to start by saying that when it comes to understanding critical race theory, what you and I must initially realize is that critical race theory, or CRT, is not some sort of Big Bang proposition. And what I mean by that is that critical race theory as a worldview is not a belief system that has come about ex nihilo. Ex nihilo is a Latin phrase. Ex means out of. Nihilo means nothing. So critical race theory is not some worldview that just came about out of nowhere. Okay? Critical race theory has a definitive genesis, and that genesis begins with a worldview that was originally advanced by two 19th century German philosophers whose names you may be familiar with. One is Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, and his compatriot Friedrich Engels, who lived from 1820 to 1895, and that worldview is commonly referred to today as Marxism. Now, there's an ideological umbilical cord, if you will, that inexorably connects critical race theory with Marxism. And that umbilical cord is a mutual disdain of and contempt for capitalism. Like Marxism, critical race theory views capitalism as the fundamental cause of racism in America. That's because in critical race theory, capitalism is what breeds white supremacy. And it is white supremacy that critical race theorists, or crits for short, as they often refer to themselves, purportedly desire to dismantle in society. Like Marxism, critical race theory is fundamentally a philosophy of class struggle. Do not forget that. Fundamentally, critical race theory is a philosophy of class struggle in which the oppression, injustice, and inequality of capitalism must be replaced with a more just, equitable, and inclusive system, namely socialism. Marxist professor Dr. Epifanio San Juan Jr. expresses that vision quite explicitly in a 2005 white paper published in the Michigan Journal of Race and Law titled From Race to Class Struggle, now check the subtitle, Reproblematizing Critical Race Theory. From Race to Class Struggle, subtitle, Reproblematizing Critical Race Theory. And in that white paper, Dr. Epifanio San Juan Jr. says this, quote, a study of racist, let me pause here. I'm going to quote several critical race theorists in my talk this morning. And what you're going to find and what you're going to hear is some of the most nonsensical academic gibberish that you've ever heard. I'm just being honest with you. But in order for us to develop as Christians an effective apologetic around this issue of critical race theory, you have to read critical race theorists. I like to say that I'm from the Godfather school of apologetics. I don't know if you've seen the Godfather trilogy, but in Godfather Part 1, young Michael Corleone says, you know, my father taught me one thing. He always taught me to keep my friends close, but my enemies closer. I keep my enemies closer. I read my enemies. And you have to read critical race theorists. If you're really going to be able to intelligently argue against this worldview, you have to read them. Listen to what Epifano San Juan Jr. says in his paper, Reproblematizing Critical Race Theory. Quote, this isn't going to make any sense, but I have to quote it anyway. A study of racist practices and institutions, divorced from the underlying determinate structure of capital accumulation and class rule, which allows such practices and institutions to exercise their naturalizing force, can only perpetuate an abstract metaphysics of race and a discourse of power that would reinforce the continuing reification or commodification of human relations in everyday life. I'm not done. Continuing to quote Dr. Epifano San Juan, we cannot multiply static determinations in an atomistic manner and at the same time acquire an intelligible totality of knowledge which we need for formulating strategies of radical social transformation. A first step in this project of renewing critical race theory is simple to state, but difficult to execute. We must begin with the concept of class as an antagonistic relation between labor and capital, and then proceed to analyze how the determinant of race is played out historically in the class-conflicted structure of capitalism and its political/ideological processes of class rule, unquote. Now, raise your hand if you understood exactly what any of that means. I quoted Dr. San Juan. You're going to hear me quote him again. And the reason I'm going to quote him so many times is because Dr. Epifano San Juan is one of the few Marxist critical race theorists who is saying the quiet part out loud. He's acknowledging the relationship between critical race theory and Marxism. This is from a Marxist professor. Online, he usually goes by E. San Juan Jr., but the E is for Epifano. But Dr. San Juan is unambiguously emphatic that in order for critical race theory to be most advantageous toward achieving the, quote, radical social transformation, unquote, that he and others who share his worldview envision, it must be posited in such a way as to mirror the foremost principle upon which Marxism is built. Don't miss this. Marxism and critical theory are built on the idea of class, and then forming antagonistic relationships between those classes. In other words, it's an antagonistic relationship between the haves and the have-nots, or what Marx referred to as the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But in critical race theory, the proletariat is black people, the bourgeoisie is white people. It is that same ideological interconnectedness that is expressed in the June 15, 2020 article on the website Marxism.com titled USA, Black Struggle and the Socialist Revolution, which states this, quote, the struggle against racism and discrimination is of crucial importance for revolutionary Marxists. Now I have to pause here. Let me repeat the sentence again. I'm going to explain why I had to pause for a second. The struggle against racism and discrimination is of crucial importance for revolutionary Marxists. This is another lie. Because if you know anything about Karl Marx, you know that Karl Marx was a racist. Karl Marx hated every ethnic minority group. Here was a guy who was a Jewish, Argentine, German citizen who hated Jews. He hated blacks. He hated Asians. So for the website Marxism.com to say that the struggle against racism has been of crucial importance for revolutionary Marxists, that's a lie. Marxism is inherently rooted in two things. Number one, atheism, And then number 2, ethnic discrimination. But continuing with the quote from Marxism.com, we fight at all times against all forms of oppression and discrimination. But we do this while fighting for maximum unity of the working class across lines of gender, race, ethnicity, and religion, always linking this to the struggle for the revolutionary socialist transformation of society. Let me pause again. You're going to hear this phrase repeatedly from me this morning. The revolutionary transformation of society, or the radical transformation of society. Whenever you hear that phrase, just understand that that's Marxist vernacular. That's fundamental Marxist terminology. Okay? Continuing with the quote from Marxism.com, there is no solution within the limits of capitalism. There is no solution within the limits of capitalism. It is above all a class question. So again, it's all about class. Capitalism is the enemy here. In order to remedy the ills of capitalism, we must destroy the capitalist way of life and replace it with a socio-Marxist way of life, where these classes essentially steal from others and redistribute to others. Steal from one class and redistribute to other classes. As always, we start with our general program. Our task as Marxists is to raise class unity, consciousness, and confidence. We do not fight only for immediate gains, but also to raise the perspective and potential for plenty of jobs, health care, housing, and education for all under socialism. We do not merely seek a, quote, more fair, unquote, division of capitalist scarcity. United class struggle is the way forward. That phrase, the way forward, that's classic communist lingo. Communism, forward, forward. You guys may have seen some of those posters from the 40s and 50s. This is classic Marxist communist language. But you have to be able to recognize that for what it is in order to sort of discern what these people are saying. The assertion that it is above all a class question. This is exactly what the website that I just read from stated. It is above all a class question. That statement cannot be overemphasized because, like Marxism, critical race theory is fundamentally a philosophy of class struggle. It pits people against one another. It is vitally important that you remember that. It's important because in critical race theory, race is fundamentally a social construct. And I'm going to explain the significance of that here in just a second. Race, I put that term in air quotes, so if you hear me use the term race, unless I'm quoting it from someone, it is an air quote term, and I'm going to explain this afternoon why that's an air quote term. Critical race theory does not see or define race as a fixed, immutable, and static aspect of one's personhood that is grounded in biology or science, or for that matter, theology, such as what we find in Acts 17:26. If you are a believer here today, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, I want to suggest Acts 17:26 is a one-verse apologetic against the idea of race. In one verse, you can nail this down biblically to debunk the idea that there's such a thing as race. I'm going to talk more about that this afternoon. But in Acts 17:26, the New American Standard Translation reads this way: "And he, that is God, made from one man, that man being Adam, every nation to live on the face of the earth." Now, what's significant about that verse? Well, what's significant about it is if you look at that word nation in the Greek, in the original Greek, that word is not talking about sovereign geographical boundaries. That word in the Greek, that noun in the Greek is the Greek noun ethnos, from where we get our English word ethnicity. So the biblically accurate term is ethnicity or ethnic, not race. Let me take a show of hands here. How many of you have ever gone to a restaurant that specializes in racial cuisine? You get my point. What do they say about what do those restaurants say about themselves? We specialize in ethnic cuisine. They never say racial cuisine. You've never read a cookbook that specializes in racial cuisine, have you? That's because race is not the right term. The right term is ethnicity, ethnic. I'll talk more about that this afternoon. But in Acts 17:26, that word nation is very key. It'll flip the whole argument around. That word nation is the word ethnos. ethnos. You see, the critical race theory views race as a social construct. Here's the significance of them viewing race as a social construct. It's crucial for us to understand that, because to understand that critical race theorists see race as a movable or changeable, it's a moving target. They see it as a social construct. When you understand that, then you also understand why critical race theory, not unlike Marxism itself, emphasizes the deconstruction of societal institutions and structures which purportedly exist solely to oppress different classes of people, such as blacks, LGBTQAs, immigrants, transgenders, and various other intersectional categories of people whose oppression is firmly rooted in the greed and avarice of white supremacist capitalists. So what I'm saying here, when critical race theories, with crits viewing race as a social construct, not a fixed biological or scientific reality, they can change the definition. Race in critical race theory has everything to do with what's going on in society. So the definition of race to them is mutable, it's changeable. It's like a handful of Play-Doh. You can just shape it to mean and look like whatever you want to look like from one day to the next. Viewing race, and this is important, viewing race as a biological or scientific reality and racism as a spiritual problem rooted in the human condition, as opposed to being a subjective social construct whose meaning changes with every shift or variation of the political and cultural winds, doesn't achieve for critical race theorists the societal eschaton they desire. The critical race theorists can afford to take a biblical worldview of race, because then they don't get what they want. This is why I say critical race theory is eschatological, because they're trying to bring in an entire new world. I'm going to explain why here in a second. So they want to replace capitalism with Marxism. And what they're trying to do in doing that, they want to invert the power dynamic, where hegemonic dynamics are inverted, so that the power is transferred from white supremacist capitalists, as critical race theorists view the problem. They want to invert that, so the power is shifted from white supremacist capitalists to cultural Marxist intersectional minorities. So what they're arguing when they say that they want equality and justice, they really don't want that. What they want to do is just invert the power structure. So what they argue right now is a white capitalist supremacist hegemonic dynamic within American culture. They want to flip that around. Well, they want to be the oppressor now. And they want white people to be the oppressed. Same prejudice, just a different hierarchy. That eschatological vision is precisely why I argue that critical race theory is not merely an ideology or philosophy, but it's an all-encompassing worldview. This is what you have to understand. Critical race theorists want to change the world as we know it. They have a vision, they have an eschatology of what they want this world to look like. And Marxism is what will get them there. I say that in light of what Dr. Epiphanius San Juan Jr., whom I quoted earlier, who in that same white paper, Reproblematizing Critical Race Theory, said this. This is why I quote this man. So when I say he's saying the quiet part out loud, listen to this quote. This is an example of what I mean. Quote, "We need to reinstate the Marxist category of class derived from the social division of labor that generates antagonistic class relations." He's saying it right out loud. The Marxist category of class will get us the antagonistic class relations that we want. Class conflict becomes the key to grasping the totality of social relations of production, as well as the metabolic process of social reproduction in which racism finds its effectivity. So what he's saying, again, just to translate this gibberish, again, he's saying that capitalism is the problem. More specifically, you white people are the problem. Continuing to quote Dr. San Juan, "This will help us clarify the changing modes of racist practices. Critical race theory can be renewed by adopting class struggle as the means of resolving racial injustice through radical structural transformation. There's that phrase again. Dr. Epifiano San Juan, as much as I disagree with him, I got to give him credit. He's saying the quiet part out loud. He's saying what other critical race theorists don't want you to know. That Marxism is the template. Marxism is the guidepost to get them the eschatological worldview that they aspire to see come to fruition. Now, please note that such phrases as antagonistic class relations, I alluded to this earlier, class conflict and social relations of production and radical structural transformation, all that is classic Marxist vernacular that accurately captures the teleology of critical race theory, which is to pit various classes of people against one another, particularly with regard to any socioeconomic distinctions that may exist between those classes, between those groups, for the sole purpose of fostering, as Dr. San Juan said, antagonistic class relations toward the ultimate goal of radical structural transformation, which is really a fancy way of saying Marxism. If you haven't read, I would highly recommend you read the book Marxism by Thomas Sowell. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with the name Thomas Sowell, but I don't know if many of you are familiar with that. Sowell used to be a Marxist himself. When asked during an interview once what brought him out of Marxism, Thomas Sowell simply replied, facts. That goal of radical structural transformation is precisely why statistics, particularly certain socio-ethnic economic data, are such valuable weapons for critics. Critical race theorists subjectively use statistics as a means to form and propagate the misleading narrative that any socioeconomic differences that may exist, particularly among blacks and whites in America, are actually disparities. And that those disparities are solely the direct result of any inequities brought about in society by an oppressive capitalistic system that is grounded in white hegemony. Now, a prime example of that kind of subjective narratology can be found in a book which perhaps many of you have read, titled Divided by Faith, which was co-authored by Michael O. Emerson and Christian Smith, that was originally published more than 20 years ago. But listen closely to me here. To view something as a disparity, which in reality is merely a difference or a distinction, presupposes the existence of a universally accepted standard of material equality by which each of us starts out in life with the same type and amount of stuff. And that for white people to be able to acquire more of that stuff, while black people in particular are unable to acquire more of that stuff, is somehow and solely the fault of systemically discriminatory policies and practices that adversely affect and impact every black person in America in precisely the same way. Hence the accusations of systemic racism. People who argue that there's systemic racism, their argument is based on a presupposition that we all started out with the same amount of stuff. Now, I would grant you that there is an inequity only in the sense, inequity is a reality only in the sense that you and I, as part of the existence, the sort of milieu in which this society exists, that we all start out at the same place, and somebody broke the rules that caused the disparity. That's an inequity. That's an inequity. But we don't all start out at the same place with the same stuff at the same time. What I'm saying to you is that not every difference is a disparity. For instance, right now, what's the temperature now? 20 something? It's warm, yeah. I don't know. Let's say it's 70 something degrees in LA right now. Is that a disparity in temperature? No. It's a difference. There's a difference. So as Christians, you have to be able to exegete the language of critical theory. which is exactly what we just did. You have to be able to identify, no, not every disparity is a disparity. It's just a difference. It's just a difference. Let me give you an even more real example. Gas right now in downtown LA is $6.15 a gallon. You don't want equality. Did I make my point? You don't want equality. You don't want that to be a disparity. Because see, disparities get fixed by the government. And you don't want the government fixing anything. You don't want the government coming into Minnesota and saying, well, we see your gas prices as a disparity. So we need to bring your gas prices up to $6.15 a gallon. Do you see the point I'm trying to make? Some differences are just differences. They're not disparities. Speaking of Thomas Sowell, rightly did he say in his book titled Discrimination and Disparities, quote, "The crucial question is not whether evils exist, but whether the evils of the past or present are automatically the cause of major economic, educational, and other social disparities today." Let me pause here. This is the Achilles heel of critical race theorists and liberation theologians and social justicians as well. They presuppose that present evils are automatically the cause of some other social disparity that exists. So what the critical race theorists will do, they will resurrect past history and try to re-prosecute that history as present reality. That's what's happening with the 1619 Project. 1619 Project is slavery, 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 slavery. That's why it's called the 1619 Project, because 1619 was the year the first African slave was touched down on North American soil in Jamestown, Virginia. Came off a ship named the White Lion. But see, what we need is a 1618 Project. Why I say that is because if you really want to, let me just say as a personal note, if you want to talk to me about slavery, don't start at 1619. Because I will not engage you. If you want to have an intellectually honest conversation about slavery, you need to start before 1619. That's why I say you need a 1618 Project. There would have been no slavery in America if it were not for black Africans who participated and profited from the slave trade. Breaking news. I stand here today as a descendant on my father's side of African slave owners. My paternal roots trace back to Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, to the Balanta tribe, B-A-L-A-N-T-A. The Balanta tribe were rice harvesters. They harvested rice as a means of making an economic living. The Balanta willingly, volitionally engaged, cooperated with, and profited from the Portuguese to sell not only their captive enemies, but their own people into slavery. So if you want to talk to me about slavery, you want to talk to Darrell Harrison about slavery, that's where we need to start. Slavery would have never come to North American soil without the willing participation of black Africans. That's for free. That's a side note. Continuing with the quote from Thomas Sowell. This is important to understand. The crucial question is not whether evils exist, but whether the evils of the past or present are automatically the cause of major economic, educational, and other social disparities. The bedrock assumption underlying many political or ideological crusades is that socioeconomic disparities are automatically somebody else's fault. This is why white people here, you're getting blamed for stuff that happened hundreds of years ago. Sowell nailed it. This is why they resurrect past history. You see, that socioeconomic disparities are automatically someone else's fault, so that our choices are either to blame society or to blame the victim. Discrimination as an explanation of economic and social disparities may have a similar emotional appeal for many. And this is how the critical race theory hooks you, by the way. Let me just take a pause with this quote. The critical race theory wants to hook you by getting you emotionally connected to their story. Yes. Well, this happened to me. A police officer pulled me over. This happened to my uncle in 1956. He was hung from a tree in Birmingham, Alabama. All that may be true, but what they try to do is use their personal epistemological experience as speaking for all black people as victims and all you white people as being as guilty as the parties that they're pointing back to. This is why Dr. Epiphaniano San Juan's paper was titled Reproblematizing. We need to find new ways to cause problems with this. Discrimination as an explanation of economic and social disparities may have a similar emotional appeal for many, but we can at least try to treat these and other theories as testable hypotheses. I have to pause again. The last thing the critical race theorist wants is to be challenged to prove their presuppositions. They don't want that. They will call you racist. They will call you every name in the book in order to be prevented or to avoid having to objectively prove their assertions. The historic consequences of treating particular beliefs as sacred dogmas beyond the reach of evidence or logic should be enough to dissuade us from going down that road again. Despite how exciting or emotionally satisfying political dogmas and the crusades resulting from those dogmas can be, or how convenient in sparing us the drudgery and discomfort of having to think through our own beliefs or test them against facts. Unquote. That's what the critical race theorist does not want. They do not want to be confronted with having to prove their beliefs factually, objectively. This is why the word critical in critical race theory does not mean analytical. It means to criticize. It means to criticize. Critical race theory criticizes everything. Every single aspect about society is under a lens of criticism. Because nothing is right with society with the critical race theorist. Nothing is right. Nothing. They criticize, they find new ways to criticize everything. So never think that the word critical means analytical. Just in Black Lives Matter, never think the word matter means the same thing to them that it means to you. The idea of socioeconomic equality, particularly as that idea is framed within a Marxian paradigm of what equality should look like, is precisely again why Dr. Epiphaniano San Juan Jr. said this in an article he wrote titled The Limits of Postcolonial Criticism, quote, "Capital ethnicizes people to promote labor segmentation, hybridity, and other differential phenomena result," unquote. So in other words, according to Dr. San Juan anyway, capitalism is what is solely responsible for any societal acrimony that exists in America today, particularly between blacks and whites. In other words, it's because you white people have stuff and black people don't have as much stuff. See, that's why I say critical race theory is presuppositional. Critical race theory presupposes that every white person in this room is wealthy. Because capitalism to the critical race theorist equals wealth. White people don't struggle to pay their bills. White people, your children are all in private school. You all live in the suburbs. You all have homes. You all have six-figure bank accounts. That's what capitalism looks like to the critical race theorist. And so the critical race theorist, the opposite of that is that black people are broke, they're struggling, they, single parent homes, they can't make ends meet, blah, blah, blah. Those are some of the presuppositions that go into critical race theory. By the way, it may interest you to know that socialism as an ideological roadmap to social justice for blacks in America is not a foreign concept. The struggle for black civil rights in America and socialism have a long history. They've been bedfellows for a long time. A long time. Let me give you one example. In a speech delivered to a group of striking railroad workers on July 22, 1877, A black socialist by the name of Peter Humphreys Clark, principal of the Colored High School in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he was grandson, by the way, of William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Peter Humphreys Clark said this, again, this is from July 22nd, 1877, quote, "The government must control capital with a strong hand. It is merely the accumulated results of industry, and there will be no justice should a few score bees in the hive take possession of the store of honey and dole it out to the workers in return for services which added to their superabundant store." Let me pause right here and say what Peter Humphreys Clark just did in 1877 was give you a high-level definition of Marxism. Marxism's main complaint is what Peter Humphreys Clark just said. You got a few score bees in the hive who take possession of all the honey, and then they kind of dole it out piecemeal to the workers whose responsibility it was, who put forth all that time and effort to put that honey into the store to begin with. Continuing to quote from Peter Humphreys Clark, "Yet such is the custom of society. Machinery and land will in time take the same course, and cooperation instead of competition, translation, socialism instead of capitalism, will be the law of society. The miserable condition into which society has fallen has but one remedy, and that remedy is to be found in socialism," unquote. This is a black socialist, Peter Humphreys Clark, going all the way back to 1877. So as I said to you at the beginning, critical race theory is not some Big Bang worldview. There are aspects of critical race theory that go back a couple hundred years. Another example is labor activist and politician A. Philip Randolph, who lived from 1889 to 1979. You may not be familiar with the name, but A. Philip Randolph was a very significant figure in the civil rights movement. Matter of fact, the 1963 I Have a Dream speech, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered on the March on Washington, that event was organized by A. Philip Randolph. As a matter of fact, if you go on YouTube and you search MLK I Have a Dream speech, you will see, I knew that was going to happen eventually. Standing over Dr. Martin Luther King's left shoulder is A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph is the gentleman who introduced Martin Luther King Jr. At that event. But listen to Dr. A. Philip Randolph in I'm quoting from a book titled Workers' Struggles, Past and Present, which was authored by Manning Marable. In that book, there's a chapter titled A. Philip Randolph and the Foundations of Black American Socialism. And in that chapter, Marable writes this, quote, "Randolph's personal background conformed in most respects to that of other first-generation black immigrants from the South. Born in Crescent City, Florida in 1889, he grew up in Jacksonville during the nadir of black-white relations. Inspired as a teenager by W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Souls of Black Folk," let me pause right here. For critical race theorists, to a person, look up to W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was a Pan-Africanist, so he supported black people going back to Africa and repatriating themselves there. He was a confrontationist. He was an antagonist. And it's because of those attributes of W.E.B. Du Bois that critical race theorists love to cite his work. You will never hear a critical race theorist cite Booker T. Washington. You will never hear a critical race theorist cite Frederick Douglass. Because those two gentlemen, as significant as they were in the abolition movement and ending slavery, being former slaves themselves, critical race theorists would consider them pacifists. Because in Marxism, it's all about protesting. It's all about demonstrating. It's all about tearing down and building up. This is why they admire W.E.B. Du Bois so much. But it was Du Bois's book, Souls of Black Folks, that A. Philip Randolph leveraged in his decision to leave the South and settle in New York City. Arriving in Harlem in the spring of 1911, Randolph first tried to become an actor. Failing at this, he drifted from one job to another. From 1912 to 1917, he attended courses at the City College of New York. A leftist philosophy professor by the name of J. Salwin Shapiro acquainted Randolph with Karl Marx's writings and other socialist literature. Randolph's discovery of socialism was so, quote, exciting, unquote, he later reflected, that he studied, quote, Marx as children read Alice in Wonderland, unquote. He formed a group of radical, quote, free thinkers, unquote, called the Independent Political Council, and began to identify himself with Harlem's premier black socialist and, quote, leading street corner orator, unquote, Hubert Harrison. No relation. Randolph joined the Socialist Party in the end of 1916 and began to lecture on black history and political economy at the Socialist Party's Rand School. By the beginning of World War I, Randolph and his new black friend Chandler Owen, a fellow socialist, had become, quote, the most notorious street corner radicals in Harlem, exceeding even Harrison in the boldness of their assault upon political and racial conditions in the country, unquote. Dr. Rayland Rabaka, a Marxist professor who is director of the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, writes this in Chapter 5 of the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. Matter of fact, I don't want to show off hands, but if anyone in this room happens to be either an administrator in public school or a teacher in public school, I highly recommend that you get the book, the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. It's called the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. But in that book, Marxist professor Rayland Rabaka, in the chapter titled W.E.B. Du Bois's Contributions to Critical Race Studies in Education, says this, quote, Du Bois's sociology of education involves not only reclamation of African historical memory in the interest of radically re-educating critical educators and students about Africa's creation of and contributions to civilization, but also a struggle over the meaning of culture and cultural meanings. I'm going to pause right there. This is why critical race theory is being taught in public schools, because they want to change your child's perception of the current culture to one that is more Afrocentric, that is one more African-centric. There's nothing wrong with learning about history. Let me just say that I was a history major in school. Majored in history, I minored in English. Nothing wrong with learning history. That's not what Rabaka is talking about here. He wants to, in his own words, radically re-educate critical educators and students about the meaning of culture and cultural meanings. So again, it's all about hermeneutics. It's not just about the story, it's about what you want the story to mean. In order to resist, continuing to quote Dr. Rabaka, in order to resist the imperialist impulse, and Marxists always refer to capitalism and capitalists as imperialists, as imperialism. So you'll know you're talking to a Marxist when they refer to the United States as an imperialist nation, colonialist nation. Again, resurrecting history in historical terms. In order to resist the imperialist impulse, continental and diasporan Africans, along with other oppressed people, must do more than merely rediscover their long-hidden history. They are obliged to also critically, quote, return to the source, unquote, of their history, which is their culture. The distinct thought and practice traditions that they have developed to sustain and enhance their life worlds and lived experiences. For Du Bois, capitalism and racism. Now listen to how Rabaka connects capitalism with all these other problems. Capitalism and racism, as with capitalism and sexism, are inextricably and constantly influenced and exacerbating each other. They are interlocking systems of exploitation, oppression, and violence that conceal a kind of cultural racism deeply embedded in the language and logic, mores and twisted morals, institutions, and individual imperialist expressions of the ruling class, white people, using race, gender, class, religion, as its neo-colonized colored lackeys, unquote. Now, so capitalism is the fault for everything to the critical race theorists. Capitalism is the problem. That's why Marxism is a solution. So here you have Dr. Raylan Robaka, again, saying the quiet part out loud. He wants to pretty much have public schools populated with critical race theorists as teachers so that those teachers can teach these students, especially black students, to dissociate themselves from white Judeo-Christian capitalist America and reconnect yourselves to what your true African origins are. Now, I mentioned earlier that my paternal roots go back to Guinea-Bissau, but I am not an African American. Do not refer to me as that. If you're talking to me one-on-one, it's okay to say black. I'm an American. My nationality is American. My ethnicity is black, but my nationality is American. No disrespect to others who may prefer that hyphenated term. I'm just talking about me. But this is the goal of critical race theory in public education. I've got an even more frightening objective to, which is another direct quote towards the end of my message. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the historical connection that the struggle for social justice for blacks in America has a long history of being connected to socialism and Marxism. Long history. Now, contrary to what may seem to be the reality on the surface, especially as I've quoted people like Randolph and Du Bois and Robaka, not all black people view capitalism in such detestable and disagreeable terms as those men. For example, Dr. Chulwe Mbetwa. Dr. Chulwe Mbetwa sees socialism quite differently, as he states in his book titled Why Africa is Poor. Why Africa is Poor. In that book, Dr. Mbetwa says this, quote, "Socialism is not adept at finding solutions to serious problems. Its emphasis on collective responsibility over and above individual responsibility rolls over lingering individual capacity to configure self-extricating measures out of crises. In the long term, socialism robs individuals of the opportunity to acquire skills for personal emancipation. Socialism struggles when it attempts to function as a propeller of wealth," unquote. Every socialist you will ever read makes this same promise, that socialism is the way to prosperity. Dr. Mbetwa says, no, it isn't. Socialism struggles when it attempts to function as a propeller of wealth. Now, I've always found it funny, not funny, humorous, but just ironic, that when you really talk about what socialism promises, what Marxism promises, you can't realize those promises, as empty as they are, without capitalism. Where's the socialist going to get the stuff from? Where's the socialist going to get the stuff that he wants to redistribute? Where's the Marxist going to get the stuff that the Marxist wants to steal and redistribute? You can't get the stuff without capitalism. I'm not going to work for free. If you want to steal my stuff and redistribute it to somebody, you're going to have to pay me to make the stuff you want to redistribute. So the promises that these ideologies make just make no sense. They make absolutely no sense. Now, to this point, I've spoken about the ideological interconnectedness between critical race theory and Marxism, but there's a chronological connectedness as well. And that chronology begins with what is known as critical theory. Critical theory, or CT for short, CT. Critical theory, defined, provides a specific interpretation of Marxist philosophy with regards to a critique or criticism of mass culture. This is what critical race theory does. It criticizes all of culture, all of society, through the lens of Marxism. In other words, critical race theory criticizes various aspects of the culture through a Marxist paradigm. Everything. Also known as the Frankfurt School, critical theory is a philosophical and sociological movement spread across many universities around the world. It was originally located at the Institute of Social Research at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany, hence why it's called the Frankfurt School. The institute was founded in 1923 by a wealthy German Jewish Argentine by the name of Felix Weil, W-E-I-L. Weil's aim for the institute, or the Frankfurt School, was to develop Marxist studies and apply those philosophies throughout Germany. Then the Nazis took over. After 1933, the Nazis forced the closure of the Institute for Social Research, and it was moved to, guess where? The United States, where it found hospitality at Columbia University in New York City. If you were to go to the Columbia University website today, you would see that the Institute for Social Research is still housed at Columbia University. When you have a spare moment, just do a search on Columbia University and communism. You will come up with a laundry list of graduates, some notable, some not so notable, communists who have graduated from that institution. So when you know the history of Columbia University and communism, it is no surprise that the Institute for Social Research, formerly the Frankfurt School, that was founded by German Marxists, now is funded and housed at Columbia University. It is the Institute for Social Research which several decades later in the 1970s gave rise to a movement known as Critical Legal Studies, or CLS. So we're going from CT to CLS. As a movement, CLS was comprised predominantly of a group of white, neo-Marxist legal scholars who sought to study the impacts of legal jurisprudence in America, but through a Marxian construct of equality and justice. It was a CLS movement. This is very important to understand contemporary critical race theory. It was the CLS movement, it was a critical legal studies movement that initiated a shift from Marxism being fundamentally a philosophy of economic class struggle, which it was orthodoxically speaking. Marxism was fundamentally a matter of economic class struggle, but CLS changed that. The critical legal studies movement morphed that from an ideology of economic class struggle to one of identity struggle. It's what I choose to call identity Marxism. It's identity Marxism. So from the CLS movement in the 1970s arose as what is known today as critical race theory, or CRT. So we're coming from the Frankfurt School in critical theory to the United States at Columbia University, critical legal studies. Now we're present day, not necessarily, but from the 70s and the CLS movement, we get CRT in the late 1980s. So similar to the CLS movement, the CRT movement began with a group of black neo-Marxist legal scholars who met at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the summer of 1989 under the belief that their predecessors in the critical legal studies movement weren't radical enough. Those guys didn't go far enough. So consider this. You got the CLS movement in the 1970s. They were content with the civil rights gains that blacks had achieved in the 1960s. They were fine with the Civil Rights Act. They were fine with the Voting Rights Act. They were fine that redlining as law, if not in practice, had come to an end. They were satisfied. They were content with those victories. But this group of black neo-Marxist studies said, nope, got to re-problematize them. Got to re-problematize them. You guys weren't radical enough. Matter of fact, two of the people who were part of that initial meeting of black neo-Marxist legal scholars at the University of Wisconsin-Madison was one Kimberly Crenshaw, the creator of the term intersectionality. Another attendee at that initial meeting was Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory, the late Derek Bell. Matter of fact, if you're taking notes, if you listen to Virgil and me often enough, you're gonna have a whole new library of books to read. If you listen to our podcast, the Just Thinking podcast, you know this already. But one book you need to pick up is a book titled Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory by Patricia Hill Collins. Patricia Hill Collins. Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. So that's 2 books. Okay? That's 2 books I've given you. Not saying that that's going to be the last one, but that's 2. So the CRT movement, late 80s, University of Wisconsin. So they met to find out, okay, how can we build on the work that our predecessors in the critical legal studies movement achieved so as to re-problematize these issues. Re-problematize these racial-centric matters of legal jurisprudence. And what was the result of such re-problematization? Dr. Daniel Subotnick, professor of law at Touro College of Law in Central Islip, New York, and author of the book Toxic Diversity, subtitled Race, Gender, and Law Talk in America, he answers that question of what's the result of all this re-problematization. He answers that question in a white paper he authored that was published in the Cornell University Journal of Law and Public Policy in the spring of 1998, titled What's Wrong with Critical Race Theory, subtitled Reopening the Case for Middle Class Values. In that paper, Dr. Daniel Subotnick said this: with control of race, quoting, with control of race discourse in their hands, critical race theorists turn their attention away from the legal academy and toward American culture in general. This is where you go again from an objective analysis of society to a subjective analysis of society that's rooted in identity, not universal fairness and equity. With control of race discourse in their hands, critical race theorists turn their attention away from the legal academy and towards American culture in general. And this they have done with enthusiasm, developing and then applying new methods for the purpose and scouring the broad landscape of American life. They have found race and racism implicated in a terrifying array of institutions and practices. Whites then stand accused and have remained largely undefended, unquote. Now let me comment here. When Dr. Subotnick says that critical race theorists have found race and racism implicated in a terrifying array of institutions and practices, he's not saying that they've objectively found evidence of that. He's saying that they're criticizing, just projecting criticisms against these institutions and organizations and accusing them of racism and racial practices. Not that they found evidence of this. Again, critical race theory criticizes. This is why Dr. Subotnick ends this quote by saying this: whites then stand accused and have remained largely undefended. So if you're white, you're guilty by existing. You're racist by virtue of the fact that you're breathing. Critical race theory, if you don't remember anything else about critical race theory, remember this: critical race theory is built upon one main presuppositional thesis that is supported by at least 3 subordinate yet equally significant presuppositional theses. The foundational presuppositional thesis upon which critical race theory is built is that racism is the normal, common, and everyday experience of all people of color in America. That is the cornerstone upon which critical race theory rests. The presupposition that racism is the normal, common, and everyday experience of all people of color in America. If you don't remember anything else about critical race theory, remember that. If someone asks you what critical race theory is, that's it. Critical race theory is the belief that racism is the normal, common, and everyday experience of people of color in America. that racism permeates every molecule of society. One example of how that presupposition has been embraced and adopted and inculcated by the culture. Listen to this from the UCLA School of Public Affairs and Critical Race Studies, whose website says the following, quote, CRT recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society. Now listen closely to the second sentence. The individual racist need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. That's another nonsensical statement. There, in the first sentence, they say, CRT recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society, but in the second sentence it says that the individual racist need not exist. How do you get pervasive racism without individual racists? It just makes no sense. This is what I mean when I say, again, critical race theory is not some big bang idea. It just didn't just poof and show up. We know as believers, as Christians, you don't just, and there's sin in the world. There's sin in the world because there's sinners. So whatever degree there's racism in the culture, that's because there's racists. But they're saying on the one hand, yep, racism is ingrained in the fabric of system of American society, but the individual racists need not exist. I first read this, I'm like, what? Continuing with this quote from the UCLA School of Public Affairs and Critical Race Studies. This is the analytical lens that CRT uses. That's a lie, because CRT is not analytical. This is the analytical lens that CRT uses in examining existing power structures. Power structures is more Marxist language. That's a Marxist term. CRT identifies that these power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color, unquote. So again, if you're white, you're supremacist by the fact merely by melanin. You're guilty by melanin. You're supremacist by the fact that you're white. Something you had absolutely no control over. Just like I had no control over me being black. Those words that I just quoted accurately frame the presuppositional thesis of critical race theory. That is, that race is endemic to every aspect of American life. Now let me backtrack for a second. Because when the UCLA School of Public Affairs and Critical Race Studies says white privilege and white supremacy perpetuates the marginalization of people of color, let me just get personal here for a second. I've been marginalized as a person of color in my life, but not in the way you think. I've been held up at gunpoint twice in my life. 2 times over my life I've had a gun pointed at the back of my head. Each time was by a young black person. Now how's that for marginalization? I've been called coon, nigger, Uncle Tom, sellout, house Negro, but never by a white person, always somebody who looked like me. There is an intra-ethnic racism in America that nobody wants to talk about. That's the elephant in the room. There was a day when I could have said that's the white elephant in the room, but you can't say that anymore. That's the elephant in the room. Every time I've been marginalized, it's been by somebody who looks like me. Within black, tribalistic, ethno-tribalistic culture in America, you must think the same way, you must have the same worldview, you must speak the same language and code, or you're going to be ostracized from that community. Virgil and I are living witnesses of this. We speak by experience. So if you want to talk about the marginalization of people of color, let's talk about how people of color marginalize themselves. I told you Christ Church was taking a risk bringing us here. So that's the primary thesis upon which critical theory makes its money. It's the presupposition that racism is everywhere. And they make their money by not having to prove it.
That's right.
You don't have to prove it. That's why I say it's presuppositional. I want to quote again Dr. Daniel Subotnick from his book Toxic Diversity. He says this, quote, if race is central because racial supremacy is central to American culture, which is precisely what critical race theorists argue, then all features of American culture are presumed tainted. Presumed. In such an environment, racism can be presumed and need not be proved. Unquote. This is how critical race theorists have it so easy. If you can just assert and just keep asserting and keep asserting that the entirety of American culture is racist, it can just be presumed. You don't have to prove it. I have a PowerPoint version of the same presentation. And one of the slides in that PowerPoint I've titled, "You Can't Win." That slide is especially for white people. Because you can't win. You can't win with the critical race theorists. This is exactly what Dr. Subotnick is saying. When the culture buys into the presupposition of critical race theory, it can just presume that they're right. They don't have to prove it. So if you're white, you can't win. Because in critical race theory, the only sin is the sin of being white. You cannot win. You can't win with the critical race theorists. You cannot. They've got it set up. The deck is stacked against you. You can't win. If you challenge them to prove it, you're a racist. So what they rely on is you not challenging them. This is exactly why Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, can charge $20,000 a pop. Racism is big business, people.
It is.
Racism is making a lot of people rich.
Yes.
Anyone ever played the board game Othello? Welcome, my fellow nerds. I like playing cerebral board games. Othello is a very cerebral board game. If you're not familiar with Othello, Othello is played on a green sort of checkerboard with these grids, and it's played with these chips. One side of the chip is black, the other side of the chip is white. You win. It's sort of a hybrid between checkers and chess. Very strategic cerebral game. You win the game once all the grids are filled with the chip. You win the game by having more of your color chips on the board than the other color. Critical race theory works like Othello. Only in critical race theory, they want all the chips to be black. They don't want any white chips on the board. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, verses 14 through 16, "For the love of Christ controls us." That's not a reality in critical race theory. I can promise you that right now. "For the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died. And he died for all, so that they who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. Therefore now," this is verse 16, 2 Corinthians 5:16, "therefore now we recognize no one according to the flesh." Now, contrary to Paul's exhortation in 2 Corinthians 5, critical race theory recognizes every person according to the flesh. Every person. Whether it's by his or her ethnicity, gender, or some other intersectional aesthetic of his or her personhood, critical race theory identifies every person according to the flesh. Now, having given you the main presupposition of critical race theory, that racism is essentially everywhere in society, there are at least 3 supporting presuppositional theses that support that main thesis. Okay, number 1, is what's called interest convergence or material determinism. That's the interest convergence or material determinism thesis. Interest convergence or material determinism thesis. This thesis holds that racism benefits and advances the interests of white people always and only at the expense of black people. Interest convergence or material determinism. That thesis holds that white people advance their own interests solely and only at the expense of black people. Number two, there's the social construction thesis. The social construction thesis. This thesis holds that race and races are products of social thought. This is what I said earlier, that race in critical race theory is a social construct. The social construction thesis holds that race and races are products of social thought and relation, not fixed biological or scientific realities. This is the same belief that Karl Marx held, that race was a social construct. Then number three is what's called the voice of color thesis, or the VOC thesis. The voice of color thesis holds that ethnic minorities are better suited to talk about systemic oppression and marginalization. In other words, if you're white, you have no right to say anything because you're the problem to begin with. So you need to shut up. You have no voice. That's what I call the voice of color thesis. You can find these terms in the book Critical Race Theory Introduction by Gene Stefancic and Richard Delgado. Speaking of whom, Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic, two of today's most influential critical race theorists, they acknowledged this, quote, in that book that I just referenced, by the way. They acknowledged this, quote, critical race theory builds on the insights of two previous movements, critical legal studies and radical feminism, to both of which it owes a large debt. It also draws from certain European philosophers and theorists, such as Antonio Gramsci, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, unquote. Now, what's significant about that is that in saying that, in giving props to Gramsci, Foucault, and Derrida, what Gene Stefancic and Richard Delgado don't tell you is that all three of those men were Marxists. All three of them. Matter of fact, Antonio Gramsci is often referred to as the godfather of cultural Marxism. In the book titled The Devil and Karl Marx, Dr. Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, makes the following and very astute assessment of today's culture against the backdrop of Marxism in the chapter titled Fundamental Transformation. Where have we heard that before? And in that chapter, Kengor writes this. This is incredibly important for you to get. Quote, in a crucial respect, classical Marxism and cultural Marxism will always bear an essential, enduring commonality, one that explains a lot about today's modern left. Both classical Marxists and cultural Marxists see history as a series of struggles that divide the world into hostile/antagonistic groups of oppressors and the oppressed. Both seek out victim groups as the anointed group that will also serve as society's redeemer group. The victim group becomes the agent for emancipation in ushering in the new and better world. See, this is why I said critical race theory is eschatological. There's a new and better world that they want to usher in. The Marxists must always, continuing to quote Dr. Kengor, the Marxists must always then be on the search for the newest victim class, which in turn must always be made aware of its victimization. Its consciousness, unquote, must be raised. Now, who do we hear that from? We heard that from Dr. Raylan Robaka earlier. We heard that from the quote I read from Marxism.com. The consciousness must be raised. In classical Marxism, this was simple. The victim group was identified by class and economics. It was the proletariat. It was the factory worker. In cultural Marxism, however, this has not been so simple because the culture is always changing. The victim group is constantly being searched for anew by the cultural Marxists. They are looking less for factory workers than cultural workers. Forget the factory floor. That project failed long ago. The new recruiting ground is the classroom floor, the campus, the university, the schools. That is where the cultural workers who can usher in the fundamental transformation are being sought and being found. These modern cultural revolutionaries are succeeding magnificently in redefining everything from marriage and family to sexuality and gender. Now, if you don't realize that, you've been living under a rock. Dr. Kengor continues, this is where today's Marxists in America and the West are toiling hard. They are working diligently on the cultural front. That is where they are confident that they can finally take down the West and its Judeo-Christian bedrock that Karl Marx and a long line of disciples looked to smash. Unquote. Dr. Kengor is absolutely right. It's not economic classism anymore. It's cultural classism. It's social classism. It's cultural Marxism now. It's not economic Marxism anymore. It's cultural Marxism. Now, as I prepare to close, I want to give you 5 reasons why CRT is unbiblical. Five reasons why critical race theory is unbiblical. Number 1, at least 5 reasons. Number 1, critical race theory categorizes image bearers of God into groups for the purpose of causing division and antagonistic class struggle. That goes against Genesis 1:27, Genesis 5:2, and Titus 3, verses 10 and 11. It categorizes image bearers of God into groups for the purpose of causing division and antagonistic class struggle. You heard me quote several critical race theorists who said that in their own words. Number 2, critical race theory imparts sinful motives to certain of God's image bearers solely on the basis of the color of their skin. It imparts sinful motives to certain of God's image bearers solely on the basis of the color of their skin. Number 3, critical race theory transfers the guilt of presumed sins of those from past generations to those of present generations. It transfers the guilt of presumed sins of those from past generations to those of present generations. That's what I call sin by proxy. I want to talk more about that this afternoon. Sin by proxy. This is what I mean when I say if you're white, you're guilty of your ancestors' presumed sins merely by the fact that you exist today. Number 4, critical race theory is rooted in the sin of ethnic partiality. That goes clearly against James chapter 2, verse 9, among other verses. The word partiality appears in Scripture more than 20 times. I don't care whether you're reading it in the Hebrew or the Greek, it's always there in a negative context. The word partiality is never used in a positive context in Scripture. Never. Other than where it says God is not a God of partiality. Number 5, critical race theory promotes materialistic covetousness and envy under the false premise of justice and equality. Critical race theory promotes materialistic covetousness and envy under the false pretense of justice and equity and equality. Now, there's much more about critical race theory that I wanted to share with you today, but in the interest of time, I must close here with what is the fundamental question that we must all consider. That fundamental question is this: is critical race theory compatible with Christianity? Now, I want to answer that question by quoting a passage from an article titled Christianity or Critical Theory by Dr. Eric B. Watkins. Dr. Watkins is senior pastor of Harvest Orthodox Presbyterian Church in San Marcos, California. The article from which I'm about to quote is published, by the way, in the October 2021 issue of Table Talk magazine. which is produced by Ligonier Ministries. If any of you subscribe to that, just go back to your October 2021 issue and you can read this article in full. But in that article, Dr. Watkins writes this, quote, "Is critical race theory's worldview compatible with Christianity? This is an important question. While it may be possible to find Christians who endorse critical theory, it is nearly impossible to find critical theorists who endorse Christianity. This is because Christianity is an overarching system of thought that seeks to define reality and posits objective moral values. According to critical theory, Christianity fosters unsafe ideologies and institutions that perpetuate anti-scientific thought, intolerance for certain sexual behaviors, parochialism, patriarchy, and a punishing authoritarianism for any who do not conform. Pre-Enlightenment Christianity is seen as stuck in the dark ages of intellectual barbarism, and the post-Enlightenment church is viewed as perpetuating colonialism, racism, sexism, chauvinism, and homophobia. Critical race theory is critical of virtually all worldviews, including Christianity. Its goal is human autonomy from any objective authority whatsoever." Unquote. Contrary to what many Marxists, crits, and black liberation theologians would have you believe, critical race theory is not merely some innocuous, innocent way of promoting anti-racism or of teaching people about the history of racism in America or of understanding how the power dynamics of white supremacy have operated in this country. For example, here's what I want to leave you with. Listen to this quote from Teresa Montano, who heads up an organization called Liberated Ethnic Studies. Liberated Ethnic Studies. Matter of fact, before I give you this quote, let me say this. One more note about critical race theory in public schools. Don't be so naive to think that your public school system is going to tell you, yeah, we teach critical race theory here. They're not going to tell you that. It's the Trojan horse. They're going to call it something else. But it's still critical race theory. They're going to call it ethnic studies. They're going to call it social emotional learning, SEL. They're going to call it DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're going to call it cultural relevant teaching. They're going to call it something else, but it's still critical race theory. This is why you need to read critical race theorists. Buy their books and read them, so that you can recognize the language for what it is. It's a Trojan horse. They're not going to tell you, yep, we teach critical race theory here. Yep, we teach Derek Bell, we teach Kimberly Crenshaw. They're not going to say that. Critical race theory is a stealth ideology. It doesn't want to be seen for what it is. Which is why this quote that I'm about to read from Teresa Montano is it's a diamond. Because here she is again saying the quiet part out loud. This is why you need to be wary of critical race theory being taught in your public school systems. Quote, here's the goal. Quote, "Ethnic studies is more than pedagogy and content. Ethnic studies is about creating change in the community. And what you will see in the lessons that follow are how classroom teachers begin to use critical race theory connected to ethnic studies in a way to empower and create social justice activists out of our students." Unquote. So if you think for a second that critical race theory is about teaching history, no, it's not. Critical race theory in public schools is designed to teach your cute little boy or girl to come out of there as a Marxist social justice activist. That's the goal. It's to make social justice activists out of your children. Listen, there is nothing innocuous or innocent about critical race theory. Critical race theory is an all-encompassing worldview, one that is steeped in cultural Marxism and that shares the same teleological ends as that which I quoted earlier from Dr. Paul Kengor, namely the takedown of the West and its Judeo-Christian bedrock. It's been my distinct honor and privilege to be with you all this morning. Thank you very much.